The envelope was still warm from his hand when he set it in front of me. I remember that detail because everything else in that room was cold. The marble floor, my mother's smile, the champagne no one had offered me. Even the air conditioning felt personal, like it had been calibrated to remind me I didn't belong. Sophie's 30th birthday party was being held in the ballroom of the Ashcombe Hotel, the same hotel where my father had once told a reporter that his family was his greatest investment. I'd read that line in a business magazine when I was 22, sitting in a gas station parking lot in my Corolla with a check engine light I couldn't afford to fix. I'd laughed so hard I scared myself. Now I was 34, sitting at a table near the back, wearing a dress I'd bought for a funeral 2 years earlier because it was the nicest thing I owned. My parents hadn't asked me to sit near the back. They hadn't needed to. Some things are understood without instruction, the way a dog knows which chair is not for sitting. My father stood at the front of the room with a champagne glass and the particular posture he used for important announcements, shoulders back, chin lifted, like a man unveiling a building rather than talking about his children. Sophie, he said, has always understood what it means to build something lasting. I watched my mother's face soften the way it never softened for me. Which is why, my father continued, starting this year, Sophie will be taking over as full heir to the Whitfield estate, the house, the company shares, and, he smiled, savoring it, the BMW is just the beginning. The room applauded. Sophie cried, the pretty kind of crying that doesn't smear mascara. Someone popped another bottle of champagne. I clapped too, because that's what you do. Because I'd spent 27 years learning exactly how much emotion was safe to show in that house, and the answer had always been less than you feel. I did not know yet what a $15 million mansion looked like on paper. I did not know yet that the beginning meant something closer to an ending. I only knew that I had a bus pass in my purse and a sister who had just been handed a small country. That was when the side door opened. A man I didn't recognize walked in like he'd been in that ballroom 100 times before, though I later learned he'd never set foot in it. He was maybe 60, silver-templed, wearing a suit that didn't try to impress anyone, the kind of suit that had already impressed everyone it needed to. He didn't go to my father. He didn't go to Sophie. He walked straight to me. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when they sense they're about to witness something they weren't invited to. "Claire Whitfield?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer, had known it longer than I could imagine. "Yes," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me, thin against all that marble. He placed the envelope on the table in front of me. It was cream-colored, slightly worn at the corners, like it had traveled through more hands than his. "My name is Thomas Reyes," he said, "and I think it's time you knew what your grandfather actually left you." Behind me, I heard my mother's champagne glass hit the table too hard. "Grandfather didn't leave Claire anything," my father said, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man watching his own script get rewritten in real time. "That's not entirely true, Mr. Whitfield, and I think after tonight, everyone in this room is going to understand exactly what you did." I looked down at the envelope. My hands, I noticed distantly, were steady. I hadn't expected that. I'd spent so long being underestimated that I'd started to believe the story too, that I was the disappointment, the accident, the daughter who didn't build lasting things. But my hands were steady, and the envelope was heavier than it looked, and somewhere behind that ballroom door, 13 years of silence were about to start making sense. I didn't open it yet. Some moments deserve to be understood slowly. I want to explain something before I go further, because none of this makes sense without it. I wasn't always the daughter sitting in the back. There's a version of my childhood I could tell you where I was simply unlucky, born second, born quieter, born without whatever specific alchemy made Sophie easy to love out loud. That version is true, but it isn't the whole truth. The whole truth is more specific, and specific things are harder to forgive. I was 7 years old the first time I heard my father call me a mistake. Not directly. He said it to my mother in the kitchen of our house on Larkspur Lane, a house with a wraparound porch and a swing my father built for Sophie's 4th birthday and never got around to building for mine. I was supposed to be asleep. I was sitting on the stairs instead, in the particular hiding spot children develop when they learn that information lives in the spaces adults think are empty. She wasn't supposed to happen, he said. Not like this, not so soon after Sophie. My mother didn't argue. That was the part that stayed with me longest, not his words, but her silence. Silence, I would learn over the next 2 decades, was my mother's primary language. She spoke it fluently, in every room, on every occasion that required her to choose between her daughters. Our town was called Ashford Hollow, a place in the kind of valley that collects morning fog the way some people collect grievances, quietly, persistently, until it's just part of the landscape. My father built custom homes for a living, and ours smelled like sawdust and ambition. He was, by every outward measure, a good provider. He was also a man who understood instinctively the difference between loving someone and being seen loving someone. Sophie got the piano lessons. I got a library card and was told to be grateful someone had thought of it. Sophie got new dresses for the fall harvest dance 3 years running. I wore her hand-me-downs, taken in at the waist by my grandmother, who was the only person in that house who ever looked at me like I was already whole. My grandfather, my father's father, a quiet man named Arthur Wakefield, who'd made his money in shipping before my father was born, used to visit on Sundays. He'd bring peppermints in his coat pocket and ask me questions no one else asked. What are you reading? What do you think happens next? What would you do, Claire, if nobody was watching? I didn't understand until much later that he was testing something, measuring something, watching to see what kind of person I'd become when no one was assigning me a role to play. He died when I was 21, in the spring of my junior year of college. I remember the funeral more clearly than almost anything else from that time, not because of grief, though there was plenty, but because of what happened after. My father stood at the front of the church and delivered a eulogy about legacy, about building things that last, about the Whitfield name enduring for generations. He didn't mention that his father had spent the last 3 years of his life barely speaking to him. He didn't mention the argument I'd overheard the Christmas before, my grandfather's voice low and furious in a way I'd never heard from him, saying words I couldn't fully make out, except for one phrase that stuck to me like a splinter. You don't get to decide what she's worth. At the time, I assumed it was about money, some old argument about the business or the house, or which grandchild deserved which portion of an inheritance that, as far as anyone told me, didn't include me at all. I was told plainly in the weeks after the funeral that my grandfather's estate had passed entirely to my father, who would distribute it as he saw fit. I was 21. I had no reason to question that. Lawyers used words like estate and distribution, and I nodded along because questioning my father in that house had never once produced anything except consequences. So I went back to college. I finished my degree in accounting, which felt like the safest, most invisible choice available to me. I got a job at a small firm 2 hours from Ashford Hollow. I built a life that required nothing from my family because I had learned, slowly and thoroughly, that needing something from them always cost more than it gave. I did not think about my grandfather's Christmas argument again for 11 years, until a man named Thomas Reyes walked into a ballroom and told me it was time I knew the truth. I was 26. I'd been dating a man named Marcus for 2 years, and he'd asked me to marry him in a way that felt, at the time, like the first unconditional thing anyone had offered me. No conditions, no comparisons. He didn't know Sophie's piano recital schedule or pair that I'd worn her old dresses. He just wanted me. I brought him to Ashford Hollow for Sunday dinner, the way you do when you're 26 and still, somewhere underneath all your careful self-protection, hoping your parents will finally see something worth celebrating in you. My father shook Marcus's hand and asked what he did for a living. Marcus told him he taught high school history and coached the debate team. I watched my father's face do the thing it did whenever something failed to impress him, a kind of polite closing, like a door settling into its frame. "Noble work," my father said, in a tone that made noble sound like a synonym for unprofitable. Later that evening, after Marcus had gone home, my mother found me in the kitchen doing the dishes I always ended up doing. "You could do better, Claire," she said. Not unkindly. That was almost worse. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. "Sophie's Daniel is a surgeon. You understand the difference that makes." "I love him," I said. "Love isn't a strategy," she said, and went back into the living room where my father was showing Sophie and Daniel the blueprints for the Ashcombe project, his newest development, the one that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. I married Marcus anyway, 6 months later, in a small ceremony at a state park 2 hours from Ashford Hollow. My parents attended. My father gave a toast that mentioned Sophie's upcoming engagement to Daniel more than it mentioned me. My mother cried during the vows, but I found out later it was because she'd just gotten off the phone with Sophie about wedding venues. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things during those years. What actually forced the family to reveal their priorities wasn't my wedding. It was what happened 18 months later, when Marcus and I decided to leave Ashford Hollow altogether. He'd been offered a position at a school 3 states away, in a small city called Millbrook, and it came with something we'd never had in Ashford Hollow: distance. I remember telling my father over the phone. I remember the pause before he spoke, a pause that told me he was recalculating something, deciding how this affected him rather than how it affected me. "You're going to walk away from your family." Not a question. "I'm going to build my own life," I said. "With a teacher's salary?" He said it like a diagnosis. "With someone who chose me," and I heard my own voice shake for the first time in years because some part of me was still hoping, even then, that he'd say something different, that he'd say stay and mean I want you here, instead of stay and mean you're useful to the family image. He didn't say either. He said, "If you do this, don't expect anything from this family going forward." I didn't understand in that moment how literal he intended that to be. We moved to Millbrook 3 weeks later. My mother sent a single card, unsigned except for her name, no note. Sophie didn't call. My father didn't speak to me for the better part of a year. I told myself I'd made peace with it. I hadn't. Not yet. Peace, I would learn, isn't something you arrive at by refusing to look at what hurt you. It's something you build, slowly, out of exactly the kind of hardship that was about to define the next 8 years of my life, and out of a truth about my grandfather's estate that no one in that family, including me, understood yet. Millbrook did not welcome us, as Marcus had hoped. The teaching job was real, but the cost of living had risen faster than the salary that came with it, and within a year we were doing the quiet arithmetic that young couples do at kitchen tables. Which bill this month? Which bill next month? Whether the car could wait another season before the transmission gave out for good. I found work at a small accounting firm run by a man named Harold Fenn, who paid fairly but not generously, and who liked me mostly because I never called in sick and never asked for a raise. I told myself that was a kind of dignity. Looking back, I think it was closer to fear. The old fear, the Ashford Hollow fear, that asking for anything marked you as ungrateful. The first real blow came 18 months in, when Marcus's contract wasn't renewed. Budget cuts, the district said, nothing personal. It felt personal the way all financial damage feels personal when you're the one absorbing it. We downsized twice in 2 years, first from the 2-bedroom apartment near the school to a smaller one above a laundromat where the dryers ran until 11 at night and the whole apartment smelled faintly of fabric softener no matter how many candles I lit. Then, when Marcus's substitute teaching income couldn't cover even that, to a single room in a house we shared with 2 other renters, an arrangement that lasted longer than I like to remember. I want to be honest about something here, because this story only means anything if I am. Those years were not romantic. They were not a montage set to inspiring music. They were long and gray and full of small grinding indignities, counting coins for laundry, choosing between the electric bill and the car payment, learning to make one chicken stretch across 4 dinners. I called my mother twice during that period, not for money. I never once asked my family for money, a fact I'm still, in some complicated way, proud of. I called because I was lonely, and because some childish part of me still believed that if she heard how hard things were, something in her might finally soften. The first call, she talked for 6 minutes about Sophie's new house. My father had helped with the down payment, and asked me, almost as an afterthought, how the little apartment was working out. I didn't correct her about the room above a laundromat. The second call, 2 years later, I mentioned that Marcus and I were having trouble making rent. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause I'd grown to recognize as my mother deciding what a piece of information cost her. Your father always said you'd figure things out eventually. You always were resourceful. It wasn't a compliment. It was an excuse, dressed up to sound like one. Resourceful meant not our responsibility. I didn't call again for 4 years. What kept me upright during that stretch wasn't my family. It was smaller things, the kind that don't make it into dramatic retellings, but that actually hold a life together. A coworker named Priya who noticed I was skipping lunch to save money and started accidentally packing too much food so she could split it with me. Harold Fenn, who let me take on freelance bookkeeping clients on the side without docking my hours. Marcus, who eventually found steady work tutoring for a test prep company, work that wasn't glamorous but was consistent, and who never once made me feel like our hardship was my fault. I studied for my CPA license at night at the kitchen table under a lamp with a flickering bulb we kept meaning to replace. It took me 3 attempts to pass the exam. I remember crying after the second failure, not the dramatic kind of crying, just quiet and exhausted, and Marcus sitting beside me saying nothing, just staying. I passed on the 3rd attempt. It felt less like triumph and more like relief, the particular relief of a door finally opening after you'd stopped expecting it to. Small wins, that's what those years were built from. A promotion to senior bookkeeper, then a handful of freelance clients who paid well and paid on time. Then, 4 years after we'd left Ashford Hollow, enough saved to move out of the shared house and into a real apartment of our own, small but ours, with a kitchen window that caught the morning light. I still didn't know during any of this what my grandfather had actually left me. I didn't know that somewhere in a filing cabinet in a law office 2 states away, a document existed with my name on it, held in a kind of trust that even my father didn't fully understand the terms of. I only knew that I was tired and proud and slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize from the girl who used to hide on the stairs. I didn't know yet that my family was about to need something from me. The call came on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate since Tuesdays had always been the ordinary days that turned out not to be ordinary at all. It was my mother's number. I almost didn't answer. 6 years of near silence had trained me to expect nothing good from that particular string of digits, but some old habit, some leftover hope I thought I'd buried, made me pick up. Claire, her voice had a warmth in it I didn't recognize, a warmth that had never once been directed at me in 32 years of being her daughter. It's so good to hear your voice. Is everything all right? I asked, because that's the question you ask when warmth from that particular source feels like a warning. Everything's wonderful, she said, too quickly. Your father and I were just talking about you, about how proud we are of everything you've built. I said nothing. I'd learned in Ashford Hollow that silence was often the safest response to a sentence that hadn't finished revealing its purpose. We were hoping, she continued, that you and Marcus might come for a visit. Sophie's getting married next spring, to Daniel, finally, and it would mean so much to have the whole family together. I want to tell you I saw through it immediately. I didn't, not entirely. Some part of me, even after everything, wanted to believe that 6 years of silence could simply resolve itself into an invitation, that my mother's warmth might be real. It took 3 more phone calls over the following month for the actual shape of things to emerge. My father's company was in trouble. Not publicly, nothing had hit the papers yet, but the Ashcombe development, the one he'd built his reputation on, had run into a zoning dispute and a lawsuit from a contractor claiming unpaid work. He needed capital, and more specifically, he needed clean capital that wouldn't require disclosures to his existing investors. He needed, as it turned out, access to the trust. I didn't know this yet in any concrete way. What I knew was that my mother's calls grew more frequent, and each one contained a little more information than the last, delivered like breadcrumbs from someone who didn't realize she was leaving a trail. Your father mentioned your grandfather's old accounts, she said during one call, her tone carefully casual. There might be some paperwork with your name attached from years ago, just a formality. He wants to make sure everything's properly consolidated before the wedding. What paperwork? I asked. Oh, you know how lawyers are, she said, laughing lightly. Everything has to be signed 6 times. I didn't know how lawyers were. I'd never been asked to sign anything in my life connected to my grandfather's estate. That was the first thread that, once pulled, wouldn't stop unraveling. I called Harold Fenn's old contact, a semi-retired estate attorney named Vance O'Coffer, and asked him, in the careful, roundabout way you ask questions when you don't yet know what you're afraid of, whether a grandchild could be named a beneficiary in a trust without ever being informed. Absolutely, he said. Happens more than you'd think. Especially with trusts that have a triggering condition attached, age thresholds, marriage clauses, sometimes something as specific as achieving financial independence from the rest of the family. Something cold moved through me when he said that. Achieving financial independence from the rest of the family. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about my grandfather's peppermints, his Sunday questions, the way he used to watch me like he was measuring something. I kept thinking about the argument I overheard as a child, you don't get to decide what she's worth, and wondering, for the first time in 11 years, whether that argument had been about me all along. The following week, my mother called again, and this time she didn't bother with warmth. There's a form your father needs you to sign. It releases any claim you might have to a certain account so we can finalize things before Sophie's wedding. It's just a formality, Claire. You were never expecting anything from that account anyway. You were never expecting anything from that account anyway. That sentence told me everything her carefulness had been trying to hide. If it were truly nothing, there would be no urgency, there would be no phone calls, there would be no form requiring my signature before a wedding that had nothing, on paper, to do with money at all. I told her I needed to think about it. She called 4 more times over the following week. Each call carried a little more pressure, a little less warmth, until the final one, when my father got on the phone himself for the first time in 6 years. "Claire," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness it took on when he was managing a problem rather than speaking to a daughter. "This is a simple matter. Sign the release. It protects the family." "Protects the family from what?" I asked. There was a pause, a long one. "From complications that don't concern you," he said. I didn't sign anything. I told him I wanted to see the actual documents first, the actual account, the actual terms, not a form summarizing them, but the source itself. The line went quiet in a way that told me I'd said something he hadn't expected me to be capable of saying. "You've changed," he said finally, and it wasn't a compliment. "Yes," I said, "I have." 3 days later, I received a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize, requesting a meeting. It was signed by a man named Thomas Reyes. That was the first time I heard his name. Thomas Reyes's office was modest, tucked into the second floor of a converted brownstone 2 hours from Millbrook. The kind of office that didn't need to impress anyone because its reputation did the work instead. He was courteous in the way of someone who had delivered difficult truths for a living long enough to have refined the delivery into something almost gentle. He offered me coffee, he asked about my drive, and then he opened a folder that had clearly been waiting for this exact meeting for a very long time. "Your grandfather," he said, "set up an irrevocable trust 14 years before he died. I've represented it since the beginning." I said, "My father told me everything passed to him." "Your father inherited the business," Thomas said carefully. "The trust was separate, entirely separate. Your grandfather structured it specifically so your father couldn't access, alter, or absorb it, regardless of what he told anyone, including you." He slid a document across the table. I recognized my grandfather's signature before I recognized anything else on the page. That particular slant he had, like his handwriting was always in a slight hurry to get somewhere honest. "You're named," he said, "as sole beneficiary. Not Sophie, not your father, you." I remember the specific silence that followed, the kind where you can hear your own pulse in your ears. "Why me?" I asked, and I meant it as an actual question, not rhetorical humility. Thomas leaned back. "Your grandfather told me, in the year before he died, that he'd watched how this family treated its 2 daughters, and he didn't like what he saw. He said Sophie would always be taken care of. Your father would see to that, one way or another. But he was worried about you. He said you were the only one in that house who ever told him the truth when he asked him a hard question." I thought about Sunday afternoons, peppermints. "What would you do, Claire, if nobody was watching?" Tereas continued. "There was a condition. The trust couldn't be accessed until you achieved full financial independence from your family. No reliance on their money, their name, or their support. He didn't want this to rescue you. He wanted it to reward you after you'd already proven you didn't need rescuing." "And now?" I asked. "Now," Thomas said, "the condition has been met. It was met technically about 18 months ago when your CPA income and Marcus's combined earnings crossed the threshold your grandfather specified. I've been monitoring it. I was waiting for the right moment to contact you." "Why now specifically?" Thomas's expression shifted, something sharper moving beneath the courtesy. "Because 3 weeks ago, your father filed paperwork attempting to fold the trust's underlying assets into a refinancing package for his Ashcombe development. He's telling his investors and his bank that those assets are his to leverage. He's wrong. And when the wedding invitation went out, requiring all involved parties to be, quote, financially consolidated before the event, that was your father trying to get you to sign away your claim quietly before anyone looked closely enough to notice what he was actually doing. The trust, it turned out, wasn't a modest sum.
It included a minority stake in Whitefield Development that my grandfather had quietly retained rather than passing through the company itself. 12%, held separately, untouched for over a decade, plus a portfolio of investments he'd built independently of my father's business. Compounded over 14 years, monitored and grown by Thomas's firm, the total value came to just over $54 million. I didn't cry when he told me the number. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a moment like that to break you open. It didn't. It did something else. It settled something, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. What happens if I don't sign the release my father wants? I asked. Then he can't touch the assets, and his refinancing falls apart, along with the loan he's already taken out against the assumption it wouldn't. And if I do sign it, then you forfeit everything your grandfather left you, and your father's fraud against his own investors becomes considerably harder to trace back to him. I sat with that for a long moment. I want to see everything, I finally said. The trust documents, the Ashcombe filings, everything my father submitted claiming those assets. I want it all before I do anything. Thomas smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. Your grandfather said you'd ask for that. He said you'd never take anyone's word for anything again. He was right to bet on you, Claire. I left that office with a box of documents and a plan beginning to take shape. Quiet, exact, unhurried. Not revenge. My grandfather hadn't built this trust as a weapon, and I didn't intend to use it as one. But Sophie's wedding was in 6 weeks, and my family was still operating under the belief that I would sign whatever they put in front of me, the way I always had. They were about to learn how wrong that belief was.
The wedding was held at the same hotel where Sophie's 30th birthday had taken place, which felt less like coincidence and more like my family's inability to imagine any life outside that particular ballroom. I arrived early, deliberately. Thomas had offered to come with me, but I'd asked him to wait outside instead, in the hotel's side office, with the full folder of documents. This part needed to be mine. My mother saw me first, and her face did something complicated. Relief, then confusion, then a flicker of calculation as she registered that I'd come alone, without Marcus, without warning, wearing a plain navy dress instead of anything that suggested celebration. Claire, she said, you came. I came, I said. We need to talk before the ceremony. My father found us a few minutes later, dressed in the tuxedo he'd clearly chosen to photograph well, his expression shifting from surprise to the particular brightness he reserved for damage control. Claire, I'm glad you're here. Have you thought more about the paperwork? I have, I said. I read everything. Something in his face went still. I know about the trust, I said. I know grandfather left it to me specifically. I know you've been trying to fold it into the Ashcombe refinancing without disclosing to your investors that it was never yours to leverage. I know your bank thinks those assets secure a loan that doesn't actually exist. My mother's champagne glass, she always seemed to be holding one at critical moments, trembled slightly in her hand. You don't understand the situation, my father said, his voice dropping into the low, controlled register he used when he needed people to feel unreasonable for questioning him. This is business. This is complicated. You've been gone for 6 years, Claire. You don't know. I know grandfather told Thomas Reyes he didn't like how this family treated its daughters. I know he built something specifically so you couldn't touch it. And I know that right now, you're about 3 signatures away from committing fraud against people who trusted you with their money. Sophie appeared then, radiant in white, Daniel beside her, both of them clearly expecting to walk into a celebration and instead walking into whatever this was. What's going on? Sophie asked. Your father, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd practiced in the car, the way that had become, over the years, simply how I spoke.
has been telling his investors that a trust belonging to me is collateral for his loans. He needs me to sign it away today, quietly, so no one asks questions before the refinancing closes next week. That's not, my father started. I have the filings, I said. I have the trust documents. I have the loan paperwork with the false asset disclosures. My lawyer is in the side office with all of it, and a colleague of his from the state's financial regulatory office, who I called on Thursday after Thomas explained what those disclosures actually meant under the law. I hadn't planned to say that last part with an audience of nearly 200 wedding guests slowly registering that something was very wrong, but I'd learned over 8 hard years that truth delivered calmly does more damage to people like my father than any amount of shouting ever could. My father's face had gone the color of old paper. "You would do this," he said quietly, "at your sister's wedding." "I didn't do this," I said. "You did, when you decided my inheritance was yours to spend without asking me. I'm simply the person who found out." Sophie was staring at our father now, something shifting behind her eyes. Not sympathy for me, not yet, but the early, uncomfortable arithmetic of a woman realizing her father's generosity toward her had always been financed by decisions she'd never been told about. "Dad," she said slowly, "is my house involved in this?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I turned to my mother. "You told me the trust was nothing. You told me I was never expecting anything from that account. You knew, didn't you? You knew what he was doing." My mother's silence, that fluent old language of hers, spoke clearly enough. I didn't stay for the rest of the confrontation. I'd said what I needed to say, and I'd learned by then that I didn't need to watch a man unravel to know he was unraveling. I walked to the side office where Thomas Reyes and a woman from the regulatory office were waiting with the documents, and I began the process of formally reclaiming what my grandfather had always intended to be mine. The wedding, I heard later, did not go smoothly. The regulatory inquiry that followed delayed the Ashcombe refinancing indefinitely and eventually unraveled it altogether. My father's company survived barely after selling off 2 other developments to cover the gap. Sophie postponed the wedding by 4 months, and when she finally did marry Daniel, I wasn't invited and I didn't ask to be. I didn't need to be. I had already gotten what I came for. Not revenge, not the $54 million, though that mattered in its own practical way. What I'd gotten was the truth, finally spoken aloud in a room that had spent 34 years pretending it didn't exist.